the more you absorb of what other writers do and have done, you're going to see, yes, you're going to see styles and you're going to love some of them. But you're going to learn by example what works and what doesn't. It's not that you study them, it comes in unconscious. But the other side of it is that if you read widely, and I read all genres and literary novels, which are just another genre, that you're not going to be influenced by one style. You're going to be influenced by 100. And that's just as good as not being influenced at all.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jared Bowen, GBH's executive arts editor and host of The Culture Show, and I am beyond thrilled to be hosting tonight's Beyond the Page with the master of suspense, Dean Koontz. It is my great pleasure to welcome a literary titan to Beyond the Page tonight, none other than the prolific Dean Koontz. With an impressive span of more than 140 novels, numerous New York Times bestsellers, and a staggering 500 million copies sold worldwide, that is, Koontz stands as a masterful storyteller. Tonight, we have the privilege of delving into the world of this literary force, gaining insights into his process, and a sneak peek into his upcoming novel, The Bad Weather Friend, in bookstores next week. Now, without further delay, please welcome to Beyond the Page, Dean Koontz.
I'll try to be coherent. Let's see how it goes.
Well, let's start by talking, before we get into your process, people are very excited to have an insight, as we mentioned, into your new book, The Bad Weather Friend. I've read that you've already described this as one of your favorites.
Yes, of course, I have many favorites out of all those I've done, but this is probably in my top 10. It's one of those books that was so much fun to write that while it's always hard work, it was nevertheless also play. And that makes a big difference when you're putting in 60-hour weeks. And I fell in love with the character of Benny and the character of Spike and Harper. So when the characters grip you, the whole experience becomes elevated.
This seems like something that you've written that also addresses the class divide that we have in our country when we have the protagonist as this really good soul, somebody that you absolutely want to root for.
Yes, the book is totally about sort of the current class divide. We have a situation in this country where a lot of the ruling class and elites don't think much of the people they rule. And Benny is just this sweet guy who's trying to gain his footing in the real estate sales market. And one day his whole life falls apart. He loses his job, he loses his fiancée, nobody wants to talk to him anymore, and his favorite chair is destroyed. So it's just a bad day all around. And he can't understand why. And suddenly he gets a gift. The gift is a very unusual gift, and it's living. And it's going to explain to him who his nemesis are and how he's going to take care of them for Benny. And it's a little scary, but it's also pretty funny, actually.
Do you enjoy writing humor? Is it harder to write humor?
I write a funny newsletter online every month. And my wife used to say I'm a frustrated stand-up comic. And there was some truth in that. I like doing events where you just have a stage and an hour and a half with an audience and a microphone, and that can be a lot of fun. And sitting down to write comic as well as suspenseful has been something I started some years ago when publishers didn't want to see it and thought it wouldn't be successful. And then with a few novels, especially starting with Odd Thomas, that was disproved.
Who are some of your favorite comedy writers?
Well, there was a great comic novelist named Donald Westlake, He also wrote some of the most terrifying, hard-boiled suspense novels with a character named Parker. But his main work was comic novels that were also suspenseful. And I was always amazed at his capacity to blend the two. He was fighting against the world at the time that said none of this is acceptable. But he made it. Many of his books were made into films for that reason.
There are so many follow-ups I want to do here, but to finish up on the Bad Weather Friend, before we start to talk about movies, for instance, and adaptations of yours, you've also done something interesting here in, to use a theater term, breaking the fourth wall, not something we often see done in novels.
It was fun. I started at certain points in the novel directly addressing the reader from me. And I didn't do a lot of it because I thought, well, I'm going to get blowback from the editor. And instead, when she read the book, her first note to me is, this is so much fun, you've got to add more of this. So I went back and added a number of more of those moments. And I've just delivered a novel called Going Home in the Dark, which does much more of that. It becomes kind of metafiction. I'm almost a character in the story. And it was among the most fun I've ever had writing. So we'll see what the public thinks. But my editor, who is pretty tough, liked The Bad Weather Friend and that aspect of it.
You are somebody who's very attuned to your readers. You correspond with your readers. So this actually sounds like a great natural evolution to develop this and have this direct engagement through the book as well. What makes you so open to hearing what people think about your books and your writing?
Well, that really evolved as the books became more popular and publishers wanted to send me out in public if I could make myself presentable. And after a considerable effort, I was able to do that. And when you get out there where the people are who are reading your books, it's terrific feedback. You rarely get anyone who spits on your shoes and says, I don't like you or what you do. So it's not just, however, that they like what you do. It's so interesting, the kind of things they'll ask or the little stories they'll tell you about how a book affected them. And it can make quite a difference in how you approach your own work. There were things the audience will tell you that moved them that is somewhat different sometimes than what you thought would move them. And maybe what you thought would move them did, but these are other things they found moving. And it reshapes in a way you approach your work when you think about those readers out there. And they're a wonderful crew. I tend to attract. I don't attack anyone, but I tend to attract readers who, when they write me, write the most intelligent, wonderful letters. And so for years, I answered those letters until I couldn't answer 20,000 letters a year anymore. So I have to select one answer, but I read them all.
Something that I think is very interesting that a lot of artists have told me. I don't know that I've often asked this of writers though, but painters have certainly told me that viewers, or in your case, readers, will find things in their work that they didn't even realize. And the work takes on a different dimension, a different shape. And I wonder how often that happens with you, that people find metaphors that maybe you didn't intend, but were lurking in your subconscious.
It does happen. And one of the reasons it happens is you don't realize that you're writing this story, that you're revealing things about yourself that you're unaware of, and sometimes things about your past. And people will come up to you at a book event and say, I think this about you or that about you. And you say, why would you think that? And they'll say, well, it was just in the last novel. And I have to stop some moments and realize, yes, it was. My wife often says to me when she reads the latest manuscript, she's my first reader. Has said to me several times, boy, everything that happens to us ends up in the novel. And it's clouded and it's put in a different context. But yes, there it is. So you review yourself without quite knowing you're doing it.
Well, this is a good moment to talk about our world right now and how, again, going back to some of the themes you talked about just at the outset of this interview that you have worked into the novel. How do you actively pull in what's happening in the world? How do you consume? Do you read newspapers? What's your way of, I guess, filtering and digesting what's happening as you write?
I read a great deal of all kinds of things, publications and so forth. I tend to watch less of the news because it's so depressing. But there's other ways to get what's happening in the world. And I have all kinds of interests that I follow in the sciences and whatnot. So all this input comes in from places that at the time you don't think you're trying to get input for a novel or looking for an idea. You're just feeding the brain. And then it surfaces later. As to the bad weather friend, I became disturbed at how much of our entertainment features really despicable characters and no one who isn't. And so when it becomes popular, you're sort of teaching people to really admire despicable people. And I thought, okay, let me write a novel about that, really. Benny is just this nice guy, but his problem is he's too nice. And he's singled out for the very reason that he's nice. And people, I won't say who, decide to destroy him because he's bringing the wrong kind of vibe into the world. And I kind of see that happening in our culture. There's just too much concentration on the negative, but not very much on the positive. So this book, I wanted to be about the positive.
How quickly, knowing that you write 2 books a year on average, how how quickly do the ideas come to you, and how much do they germinate before you can sit down and start writing?
The ideas are always there. There's usually a whole queue of ideas that I have to choose from. But the way it usually works is as I'm finishing a book, I'm looking over ideas of what I want to write next. And almost always something else hits me. And it's so appealing that I want to get to that immediately. I don't use outlines. It's all about character and story idea, the premise, I would say. And then I go with it. So generally that works really well. Once in a great while, you get to the middle and say, what am I doing? And then you have to put it aside for a little bit and work on something else. But that's rare. The ideas come from a line in a song, from something you see in the newspaper. That's rare. And people think you get your ideas from dreams. But I have only ever had 2 novel ideas from a dream that I actually ended up writing. So out of all those I've done, that's not much of a source.
Do you take any time all at all? I'm guessing by your last answer, I'm thinking no, but do you take any time off at all in between writing?
I eat dinner and I'm not writing while I do it. And I have a little time between books. The thing is, I have work that becomes play to me, and that is a great gift. So, yes, I put in 60 or 70-hour weeks, depending on where I am in the book. Sometimes I've been known to do more if I just don't want to stop. But it isn't quite like going to an office or doing something I don't want to do. That 60 hours can go by in a flash. And I wouldn't want to do anything else. I'm often asked, when are you going to retire? Well, when I fall dead in the keyboard, that's probably when I'll retire.
I'm somebody who's incredibly interested in process, and I wonder about yours. Do you have to be in a certain space? Do you have to have certain equipment to write? How do you structure your writing time?
I have to be in my office. I'm not one of those who can grab a laptop and go out and sit among the trees and write. I need to be at my desk. I get there at usually around, I get up at 5, and then it's shower and walk the dog and feed the dog and cuddle the dog. And so by 7:30, I'm working, and I work straight through till dinner. I don't need much else except my library, because I have a very extensive library with research materials. I still find books more reliable than online, but I, through my assistant, use online more and more. And that's about it with me. I have my computer, I have my diet soda, and if I have that, I can do it.
I think I read that that diet soda almost got you in big trouble a few years ago, health wise.
I was drinking fully caffeinated sodas, Coca-Cola. There's nothing wrong with Coca-Cola, but I was drinking 12, 14 a day, and I developed a bleeding ulcer that almost killed me. I lost 50% of my blood overnight while I was sleeping, and I didn't know it was happening because, of course, it's internal bleeding. And I only knew something was wrong the next morning, where I literally passed out in my office floor. And I ended up in an ICU for 3 days, which is no fun. But yeah, and I was very close to the end of the book. So my fear was, oh my God, I'm going to die, and that thing is not going to be finished, which is the worst fear a writer generally has. But I didn't die, and I got out. But I was given an ultimatum. You can have one caffeinated soda a day, and then you can have all of the other ones you want, but no more than that.
That's a tough habit to break. I've had friends who've had to do that.
Yeah. It's a preview of hell to have to give up caffeine. But
As you talk about doing research and you have your library and go to online to some extent, because I know, and you don't even do it yourself, somebody else does it for you, you keep away from that. But when you work in the fantastical realm, how does that come about? Is there science that you're trying to base it on, and how much of it is just coming to the fore, these worlds, these elements in your mind?
it happens in different ways. I do read a lot of science. I'm particularly fascinated with quantum mechanics and molecular biology, and have quite a lot of books on those subjects. And but where the fantastic, I've started books with no idea they were going to have an element of fantastic, and there it was. It came in of its own accord. And sometimes when things like that happen, you go, no, that isn't what I thought this book was going to be like. But I long ago learned that you're working out of some subconscious level that is telling you what you need to do. And you're battling yourself if you say, no, that doesn't work. You should just go with it. And when you go with it, it always works better than if you had held to the original idea of exactly what this novel is.
I want to go back to you mentioning your wife. You've been married, I think you're coming up on close to 60 years. You've been together for so long. You mentioned she's your first reader. What has been, how has she been an influence in your writing over the years? And let me just pause for a second to say this is also for people who have your questions. We'll be taking them in the second half hour. So please enter your questions in the chat so I can get to those as we continue this conversation. But I'd love to hear more about the relationship you have with your wife and her influence on your career.
Well, it's been profound. And I sometimes say it's amazing she married me. I was a shy kid. My dad was the town drunk. But I saw her crossing the street one day and asked a friend of mine, "Who's that?" And he said, "Oh, you don't want anything to do with her. She's the town shoemaker's daughter." And I said, "I'm the town drunk's son. That's a big social step up." And I asked her out on 4 occasions, and she turned me down. And the first time she said, "Well, I'm busy working at the dry cleaner that night." And the second time she said, "I'm busy working at the theater that night." And I thought, damn, she forgot to lie. The third time she said, "Oh, I can't, I'm babysitting that night." And all of this was true because she came from a family almost as poor as mine, but her father was an Italian immigrant. And part of the thing was, when you're 12 or 13, if you want anything, you go get a job and earn your clothes for this. So the fourth time I asked her out, she was her class president every year through junior high and high school. And I asked her for her class dance. How could she turn me down? And she said, "I can't, I'm busy that night." And she said, "I have to sell tickets at the door, then I have to run the record player, then I have to sell refreshments, and then I have to be in the crew cleaning up the gym." So I said, "Well, good, that'll be our date." And that was our date. And it was a lot of fun. And we've been together ever since.
And you said she's your first read. What other ways during your writing, in your writing, do you intersect?
Well, one of the biggest things is we have different skills. My skill is words. After that, not much of anything. Her background is accounting. She's excellent at all that. So long ago, she just took over everything, like when we have assistants at payroll, in background in investing and all of that. So I can't balance a checkbook. If it was a law that I had to, I'd be in prison. So she takes all that off me. But it turns out she was a book lover. We didn't have TV for the first 5 years we were married. Started out, we couldn't afford one. And then we didn't want one. And we would each read about 200 books a year. And that's how we spent our evenings and our weekends. And so she has a very good story sense and character sense. And she never hesitates to tell me what she thinks. And being a man, I say, "Oh, I don't think that's right." And then I go away into my office and make a change. So it's kind of embarrassing.
How much do you read now?
I read so much research. I don't read as much fiction as I used to, but I still read a lot. I think we don't spend much time watching television, usually right before bed. So reading time is big, but I spend a lot of time writing. And I didn't do that when we were first married. I spent 3 or 4 hours a day writing, not 10 or more.
I've read that you will polish a page 20 or 30 times before moving on to the next one. Tell me about that process and why that has to be the case before you feel that you can move on to the next.
It comes from self-doubt. I have always had more self-doubt than any writer I've ever. And I thought as I got older and published more, it would go away, but it does not go away. So quite a number of years ago, I realized that to avoid writer's block that always comes out of self-doubt, I needed to make each page as perfect as I could, that the language flowed as well as possible, that I could go over it and over it and see nothing to correct. And then I could move on to the next page. The next page, that self-doubt comes back, and then I do the whole thing. But I know when I've polished that page, and sometimes it's 5 to 10 times, but a lot of times it's much more often than that. Then at the end of the chapter, I print it out and pencil it twice, because you see things on a printed page you don't see on the screen. And it's worked very well for me. Some people say, "Well, how do you keep the flow of story going?" Actually, it works very well for that, because instead of writing a quick draft and creating problems for yourself, you've always got time to think ahead to what's coming or where the problems are. And you have time subconsciously to think your way through those problems. So when you reach them, you've already got solutions. So it's the way I've written for the longest time. And it's the only way I can write.
And you say it's rooted in self-doubt. Does the self-doubt continue? You've heard, your own numbers, the ones I cited as I introduced you. 500 million copies sold, 140 books, New York Times bestseller list. And the doubt, does that still stay with you to this day?
I think some of my earlier publishers made sure that it would. When I first hit #1, my publisher called me up. You learn about that about 10 days ahead because they print the book review section early ahead of the newspaper. And she called me up and said, I have great news. You're going to be #1 on the New York Times. And before I could say anything, she said, but I want you to understand this will never happen again because you don't write the kind of books that can be #1. And I was sort of took the joy out of the moment for a while. And then we had 4 more #1s in a row. And every single time, that's what I was told. You don't write the kind of books that can have this success. So that kept me rather humble through all those early years. And I've had enough resistance to what I've written. I change constantly what I'm writing. I mix genres, which when I started doing that, nobody did. And I got big blowback about it. So I'm always trying, like you said, breaking the fourth wall in this new book. And that gets often, although my current editor and publisher doesn't seem rattled by it, but often the publishers were rattled by it. When I delivered Thomas, my publisher was so unhappy with it, they refused to talk to me about it. And my editor had to convey how much he disliked it. But it turned out the public didn't feel the same way. So all of that stuff that happens to you as you go through a career can keep you pretty humble and keep you on self-doubt that you wish you didn't have.
Well, this next question, I guess, is just the total opposite of that. Knowing that how well your books have resonated with so many people, and because you do correspond with them and read the letters, have you come away with a fundamental understanding about, I'm sure you don't even want to hear success because I can hear that self-doubt in you, but to know why you are successful with readers, why they do resonate, and why they're so ravenous and want to read book after book after book?
I think it comes back to, let's say, 3 things. It's probably more than 3. But these things I know for sure because of all the feedback I get. That process of writing, smoothing that language until you can't make it smoother, until you can't make it more vivid. And that keeps the pages moving. And it also, I've had literally a couple of thousand letters from people who are dyslexic, sometimes for a long part of their life, and who said the first book I could read was one of yours. And then I read a second, and after that, I could read anything. And I was recently talking to some scientists about that, and it was interesting what their feedback was. And I said, what it showed me is dyslexia isn't a biological condition, really. It may be an emotional or psychological condition. And when they get the right thing they want to read more, it can resolve itself. So the smoothness of it, the vividness of it is important. The characters, I feel there has to be, when you have to loathe a character, you really gotta loathe them. And when you want to like him, you gotta love him. So I work very hard on that. But I think the biggest thing that I've gotten the most mail on is people relate to the fact that the books have, no matter how many bad things happen in them, the thrust of the book is hopeful. And I have received so many letters and feedbacks about people saying, I always finish your book with a sense of hope. And that tells me when you get that so many thousands of times, that's a key issue of why it resonates so well.
I'm going to ask just one more before I start to fold in yours, because I promised I would ask it in the first half hour, and that's about the film adaptations of your book. What do you think of Hollywood, Dean Koontz?
There's almost none of them adaptations I would like to talk about. I think Steve Sommers did a pretty credible job with Bob Thomas, and I like Steve enormously, but there were budgetary problems that almost wrecked the whole picture. There have been a few things that I like. I'm more focused on thinking about the future. Right now, we have 19 properties in development for a film or TV. And some of the people we're dealing with, actually, most of them, are quite capable of turning these things into good visual entertainment. So I'm still upbeat about it all. And I've met a few people in the business that have become friends. Not a lot, but some. You come out of studio meetings not making a lot of friends, but now and then you find somebody who's down to earth, and that's been a valuable thing. But I'm just looking forward to see what they do. We recently made a deal for the 5 Jane Austen novels, and I'm particularly interested in seeing what they might do with those.
All right, let me start to go to our questions. Let me just slide this over. Let me see here. We'll start with a good question for probably a writer in the audience from Brian. What cautions or advice would you give to a writer seeking to get published for the first time?
Do we have 6 hours? You just have to understand that, at least in my experience, it will never be easy. I know from the outside, my career looks like that beautiful, smooth arc, but it was always a struggle throughout the whole course of it. But you have to have confidence in what you're doing. I have all that self-doubt, but I always knew that if you just persevered and didn't sell out and didn't give up, that there was a chance this would work. And it's perseverance. I often say to young writers, perseverance matters almost as much as talent. And you just have to stay with it. It is very easy to be discouraged because you're sitting alone in a room. And if you like people or like to be out and about, it's a very tough job. But if you have the perseverance and the talent, they have to come together, then the biggest thing is to just stay with it.
I like what you said about selling out. How do you define, when you said don't sell out, how do you define selling out?
Giving up what you believe in to write what you think will sell. I often say, don't scope the market. Don't look and see what's selling and then write that. Because by the time you write it, and if, let's say you're a success and you publish a book or 2 or 3 in a particular kind of book, because that's what's selling, then suddenly it won't be selling anymore. Remember all the zombie novels that were so popular for a while? You don't see those anymore. And what happens to so many people who wrote just zombie novels is their careers are over because they didn't write what they would have loved to write. They wrote what they thought would sell. And you never can play that game because in the end, it won't be the thing that's selling by the time you're 5 years down the road.
This question comes from Abby. I read Intensity and I was so absolutely scared. You created a character who was so psychologically frightening How do you do it?
Well, just look at me. It's how could I not do that? I think partly my dad was late in life diagnosed as sociopathic, and he certainly was. He had problems all his life, and he was dangerous. I think some of that helped me shape sociopathic characters. And it's not so much writing what you experienced as writing what you feared might happen. And that's where a character like this in intensity comes from. But it's also that element of hope and that belief in courage and self-sacrifice that I think makes that book work. The character of China. I remember when I was writing that, I was in love with China because she was so courageous. And then she gets to a point in the novel, not to give much away, where she escapes from this horrible sociopath. But in the meantime, she has just learned that he's got a girl captive in the house where he lives, and she's only 14. And China makes the decision, because she can't get hold of police and anything else, that she will get back into the motorhome that she was in with him, that he didn't know she was with him. And she's going to have to find that girl. That's stuff that I love because it happens in real life. But those kind of people very seldom get written about. And it adds a depth. Yes, that is terrible. But look at this courageous woman who's willing to go up against him. And that balances the terror, I think, where it did for me. Because if I didn't have her in that novel, and she was just another victim, I couldn't have written it.
What about you consuming horror? Can you withstand it?
I can't watch bloody movies. I just don't have the nerve for that. I can read anything scary, but the only bloody movies I've ever been able to sit through are ones that my wife recommended, and they're the John Wick movies. And my wife said, "You got to watch these." And I said, "I understand they're super bloody. I don't care to watch them." She said, "They are, but they aren't. It's like opera. It's like something else. It's not real." And I said, "I still don't want it." It took her about a year to talk me into watching the first, and then I've watched them all. But I have to watch them with her because she'll take care of them.
I appreciate the suggestion. I've not watched them yet. You reminded me. I will check them out now. This comes from Kayla. As a first-time reader of yours, which book do you recommend I read first?
Well, I think most people would say Watchers. I think it is the best-selling book I've ever written. It's 12 or 14 million copies worldwide, and it just goes on and on. And it's a dog story, but not like any dog story I think you've seen before. Other than that, I would say Odd Thomas, the first book in the series, the Jane Haunt series, or Life Expectancy is a book that I particularly love, and The Bad Weather Friend. Plus, I've got some other things coming, so I don't want to turn you off what's about to appear.
Do you ever go back and read your old books?
A little bit, but it's an odd thing to do. What's sort of surprising to me is if you go back long enough, there are things that happened in the book that startled me. It's like I wrote this, but it was so long ago, I've sort of forgotten some of the developments in the storyline. But I'm always too busy reading research or other fiction I would like to read by other writers than I am to go back and read myself.
I wonder about that too. The other books from other writers, if you're ever concerned that their style might inform you or seep into you.
I've known writers who say, "I don't want to read other fiction because I don't want that to happen." And I've always said, I don't understand that at all the writers I've known that have been really, in my estimation, good were heavy readers of novels. And for one reason, the more you absorb of what other writers do and have done, you're going to see, yes, you're going to see styles and you're going to love some of them. But you're going to learn by example what works and what doesn't. It's not that you study them, it comes in unconscious. But the other side of it is that if you read widely, and I read all genres and literary novels, which are just another genre, that you're not going to be influenced by one style. You're going to be influenced by 100. And that's just as good as not being influenced at all.
Well, a good follow-up to that comes from an anonymous attendee who asks, are you and Stephen King friends?
We've never met. So it's everybody thinks you, because you're a writer, you know all these other writers. I know very few other writers, really, and I'm friends with only a few.
How did writing on a computer or laptop change your writing process from the time of writing longhand or on a typewriter? This comes from Robert.
Well, I never wrote longhand. Well, I did once. The first chapter of Odd Thomas, which felt like it was dictated to me. But otherwise, when I was the last writer I knew to get a computer, I was using an IBM Selectric typewriter, which I thought was just the most amazing invention. And my wife said to me one day, do you realize how many pages you discarded in order for each page that ended up in the final manuscript? I had no idea. She bought the paper. I threw them away. And generally, I threw them on the floor till I couldn't wade through them. And she said, you threw away 30 pages for each one you had finished. And I went, oh my God, that's ridiculous. And I got a computer. And what I was doing was that same revision. But when you have to retype a page to revise it, that is so much harder than just the computer being able to go over it and over and over it again. So computer changed how I wrote, but it also made what I write, I think, much better because revision became so much easier.
Heather asks, what types of books did you read as a child?
Well, the first one I remember was The Wind in the Willows, which the animal story and fantasy. And then until I was almost through college, other than what I was assigned to read, I read science fiction and fantasy exclusively. And it was only after college that I started reading so widely about other things. So I grew up reading Ray Bradbury and Robert Heinlein and Theodore Sturgeon, and a lot of those wonderful writers in science fiction and fantasy. And then in my 20s, I found John MacDonald, one of the greatest American writers ever, and then moved on to Dickens, which when I was assigned Dickens and things like that in high school and college, I never read them. I faked it. I wrote reports and made up details. And never got caught. That's what always amazed me. I suspect the professors might not actually read those papers, but when I was, I would not read what I was assigned. Once in a while I would, but I wouldn't read it basically because there was too much else I wanted to read on my own. And then when I got older and more mature, I really started reading all that stuff and I fell in love with it.
I feel like I missed an opportunity for a follow-up question. Is there a reason that you're not friends with more writers?
Well, I spent a lot of time writing, and I don't go to writers' conventions. I went to a couple. I'll just be frank. I went to a couple where there were writers that were gods to me. And no writer is a god. I'm not. But when you're young and you've read everything by this writer and you go and meet them and they're falling down drunk or pawing your wife or whatever, you go, oh. And I thought at some point, it's better not knowing. And maybe they're wonderful, but it's too deflating to find out. But there were a few people I met over the years. There's a fantasy writer named Tim Powers that is a good friend, and there are a few others. But I have a lot of friends in the construction trades, cabinet makers, masons, design, interior architectural designers, people like that, who are in creative enterprises. They're just not novels. There's several painters, contemporary painters that I've become friendly with. I tend to go toward the creative, but a mason can, if he's really good, can be in his own way as creative as any writer. And that's what I've been drawn to as we've remodeled houses and built houses. I found a simpatico in those trades.
Can you take us back in time at the point you were trying to find an agent for your first book? And how was that process? This comes from an anonymous person as well.
Well, I won't name names, but the first agent I had was a crook and stole probably a third of the money I was earning. The second agent I had was a lovely guy, very supportive and honest. And I liked him personally. We had a great personal relationship as well as a business one. But I began to propose ideas, and I was writing outlines at that time, and he wouldn't market them. And I finally said, what's going on? Well, he said, you're trying to write books that reach out to a much wider audience, and you're never going to be able to do that. You're a mid-list writer, and you're going to be very successful as a mid-list writer, but you're never going to have a bestseller, or you're never going to have this kind of book that attracts this audience. And I had to leave. And it was emotionally difficult because I liked him so much. Then I moved on to an agent who was working more for the publisher than for me, but we had a lot of success until I began to realize the terms of my contract weren't what they ought to be. And then I moved on to a very aggressive agent who was great making a deal, but not so great in the interactions with publishers and stuff. When you had a problem, he was not there. But now I have the best agents I've ever had. I had to get to be 70 before I got agents that I totally loved. So, you know, there's always a possibility. I'm lucky that I married somebody I loved early. So I just had to wait a long time for the agents to be ready.
There are definitely trade-offs. I love this next question. It's one I actually love to ask because the answer is always different. This comes from Sarita. I'm interested in knowing how many, nope, I'm going to ask a different one, but the same person. You're the only author I know who can entertain everyone in my family, differing ages and genders. Do you keep the audience in mind as you write, or is it just focused on the story?
You know, I'll go somewhere I would think I would go, but it ties to this story. I started getting mail early on from women readers. And they say, I don't understand how a man can understand women characters this way. And I thought that was such an odd question. And then I would get letters from Black readers who would say, how do you, a white person, write a Black character this convincing? And I've gotten so many of those. I've gotten intelligent letters from 11-year-olds who write me wonderful letters, totally articulate. But they also, you write kids so good. How do you write kids this way? And this always has sort of astonished me. And finally, the only answer I could give is, It doesn't matter what race we are. It doesn't matter what age we are. It doesn't matter what gender we are. We're all human beings. And if you write characters, not so much trying to structure who might like this, but just your experience of humanity, and try to be faithful to what people are really like, then you tend to hit across the board. It's not something I ever made an effort for, but it happened.
So this is what I started to ask, same questioner. I am interested in knowing how many thesauri you use, because I have to keep a dictionary with me when I read you, which I love. I feel like my mind expands, not just due to the content, but expanding my word knowledge. Thank you for that.
I get that question. I don't refer. I just read so much and retained it in my life that I have all this vocabulary. And I will say that in the early years of Putnam, one of the reasons that publisher told me I didn't write the kind of books that could make #1 or even the bestseller list was she said, your vocabulary is too big. You have to keep it to 500 words. And there's all this kind of advice you get that underestimates the reading public. So I never stopped to think. In fact, the book I just finished has some jokes about the words that show up in it. And I will enter the story to say, I'm sorry for that word if you have to look it up. It just landed in the sentence with a flood, and it's too late. And so I've been having fun with that. But it's never held the public back. That I trust them. I think they're a lot smarter than the New York publishing world thinks they are, and treat them with respect and expect them to read up to what you're writing. And surprise, surprise, they do.
This comes from Charlotte. You mentioned quantum mechanics. Does this influence your ideas of spirituality?
Yes, in fact, it does. The quantum world is absolutely fascinating. I say I think it's in The Bad Weather Friend, actually, the very end of the book, that as we now understand through quantum mechanics, there is no matter. Everything is a particle force. And if you go deep, deep down, rocks, mountains, water, blood, bone, everything is simply woven out of nothing. It's all sort of astonishing, and it makes you start to think it's all almost like thought waves, eternally weaving, and that's where everything is built up from. And then when I read microbiology, I have a friend who is extremely knowledgeable in that. He's a biologist. We just had dinner and got into this. You go back to even the turn of the 1900s, late 1800s, science thought the human cell was, quote unquote, a blob of carbonized albumin. In other words, just the same thing inside this cell. But now we know there are thousands of parts to a human cell. There are all these proteins in it that go on and on, a number of molecules in them. And one of them, the cell doesn't function. So as you look at this, you start to get a sense of the world as a highly organized place. It doesn't make sense, it seems, to have arranged itself accidentally.
Well, the final question of the evening will come from me. You just have done so much. You have so much acclaim and fame, and you've accomplished so much. I'm sure what you surpassed what you wanted to do. And yet you came from such humble beginnings, as you mentioned, a difficult childhood. How do you look at your life now versus where you started out?
It's amazing. I'm grateful every day, and grateful for every day. Just have as long a life as I've had. It's when I was trying to write full-time. I was teaching school. I was selling short stories and then paperback novel, but I wasn't earning enough to live on. And my wife said one day, she was gainfully employed, she said, I'll support you for 5 years while you try to make it. If you don't make it in 5 years, you never make it. I sometimes say I tried to negotiate her to 7, but she has Sicilian blood, so she wins every negotiation. And it took almost 5 years. And at the end of 5 years, she was able to quit her job and go to work with me. So when I look back at where we came from, when I look back, my mother was a wonderful person that had an awful life. And my father was largely the reason. And I look at where it all started. It's no surprise that hope is a part of what I write, because you can never give up on life. You can never give up on any dream. They may not come true, but life is so much better having a dream to live with and striving toward than it would otherwise be. It gives life meaning and purpose. And here it is. It worked out wonderfully. I have people come up to me and say, oh, I started reading you when I was in high school. And I just retired so I could spend more time with my grandchildren. And when they say that, I go, wow, that's kind of astonishing. And it's much better than when they come up and look at you and say, oh my God, you're old. It's a nicer way of saying that. So when I look back over all of it, it's pretty amazing and pretty wonderful. And I just love all the people who gave me a chance to do it, which is the review.
Well, Dean Koontz, thank you so much for being so generous with your time tonight. We really appreciate it. I personally have loved this conversation, and it's meaningful to me too. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Jared. You did a great job. And the questions from folks out there will be great.
I agree. Again, thank you. And thank you to everyone for joining me in tonight's conversation. If you loved tonight's program and are wanting more, you can now register for next month's Beyond the Page with Kristen Hanna. The link is in the chat. And don't forget, you can listen to The Culture Show from 2 to 3 o'clock every afternoon as we dive into conversations around music, art, food, books, theater, opera, dance, food, film, all the arts and culture coverage. And if you ever miss us on the radio, you can always download our podcast. I am so thankful to have you all here tonight and echo my appreciation for your great questions. Have a great night.